So, life story video. Haven't done one in a long time. And I was actually talking to Mike Goucher at Street Legends. And he was talking about, I guess he went back and looked at some old videos and stuff like that. And he said, man, I've been talking to some people. He said, man, you've been doing the street racing shit for a long time. And I said, yeah, and I kind of laughed about it. And he goes, why don't you ever tell that story? Let everybody know what got you started doing this. So I've been thinking about that for about a week. So I thought, well, haven't done one in a while, and you guys used to really like when I did those, so let's do one. What got me street racing was my dad. My dad, and I get emotional when I talk about my dad because he's gone. And my dad was a man's man. He was a hard man. He was hard on all of us, but one thing my dad did was he loved his boys more than anything in the world. So my dad back, and I can even remember the year, 1975 and 1976. So I was 6 years old, 7 years old. My dad had a 65 Chevy short wide pickup, big back glass, maroon 427, square port heads, 2 4s, often has a 360 degree manifold on it, 2 650 vacuum secondary carburetors. Kenny Bell switch pitch converter. I remember all this shit like it was yesterday. 411 gear. My dad ran a 31 1250 tire on it, and the front, with baby moons on the back. There's no bullshit, guys. He ran a set of bias ply trailer tires on the front of it for less rolling resistance with a set of Studebaker hubcaps. Now my dad used to street race, and every Friday night and Saturday night, I'd watch my dad with one of his buddies jump in this truck and they go looking for a race. Now, back then, talking 1975, 1976, my dad never went to the racetrack. All he did was street race. And he street raced around Muskogee a lot, Muskogee, Oklahoma. There was a guy there that had a Superbird named JJ, believe it or not. And that was the only person that my dad had not outran in Muskogee back then. And those two looked for each other every Friday, Saturday night, and always seemed to miss each other. Cops would come, something like that. So I would watch my dad get up, and all through the week, my dad would pull the motor out of that truck. As soon as it started to get cold, the motor came out of that truck. It got a new fresh set of rings, fresh set of bearings, fresh set of valve springs. And I remember one time we were sitting in the living room, and my dad had these 4 cam. But back then they weren't boxes, they were in tubes. And he had 4 of them laid out there. And he said, which one of these camshafts, this is what we got in the truck now, which was believe it or not, a GM LS6 camshaft. He said, then we have, this is what's in the truck now. We have this first design L88 camshaft, this second design L88 camshaft. And he said, which one do you think we ought to put in the truck? Leave the cam that's in it, or do you think we ought to change it? I said, well, which one's the biggest one? And he said, well, the second design L88's the biggest one. I said, well, that's the one we ought to put in it. Keep in mind, guys, I was Brantley's age. This is no bullshit. I was Brantley's age. But my dad walked on water as far as I was concerned. I spent every minute of every day that I possibly could with him back when I was growing up, because I looked up to him. My dad was everything. And that's when he told me, he said, bigger's not always better, boy. He said, what you got to think about, the entire combination of what you're working on. And he ran a dual point distributor a Mallory dual point distributor that he recurved, and it was old school Anquinay shit. But back then, it was pretty cool shit to have. Matter of fact, he built his exhaust out of drive lines. That's no bullshit. Drive lines back then, were about 3.5 inches long, and it always tapered down to the yoke. My dad had a set welded to the headers, came back 4 foot. Then he had it where the small end, where the big end would slip over the small end, and he had springs that hooked onto it, and then he had the mufflers on it, dumped out in front of the rear end. So when we were talking about this camshaft change, that's when he explained to me, it's not always the biggest, it's the best. And every Friday, Saturday night when my dad would go out, I'd beg him to let me go. come on, Dad, let me go, let me go. And he said, no, boy, street racing is dangerous. He said, the last thing you do is you take a kid with you to do to street race. My dad never went to the track. One time, a friend of ours, Rick Sherrill, had a rear motor dragster. And they went up to Tulsa, and my dad was helping him with the dragster. A little backstory about my dad. If you guys go back and look, there was 2 jet cars back in the 70s, early 80s that were the jet cars that everybody loved to watch. It was USA 1 and the Green Mamba that was drove by Doug Rose. Doug Rose had 2 wooden legs. I heard he passed not too long ago. But my dad helped build both those cars because he was actually a jet mechanic in the Air Force, got into a car wreck, and got discharged because he had a scar that went all the way around his head where he split his head smooth open this car wreck. So he was discharged, and he was discharged 2 days before the Vietnam War started. So my dad was always peacetime, as they considered, because he hadn't, the Vietnam War was still a conflict back then, hadn't been declared a war. But my dad he's like me, self-taught at everything that he done. My dad didn't hardly teach me shit, believe it or not. My dad actually caused me more problems when I was doing something than he did help me. But he helped me in his way. I used to build transmissions because I couldn't afford to have nobody build one. So I learned how to build transmissions. Everything that I've ever done is because I never had no money, guys. Believe it or not, I never had no money. I was married. I was with my first wife and had a kid at 17 years old. And I used to hustle. That's all I did was hustle. And it wasn't dope hustle. It was car parts hustle. I used to go to 30-some swap meets a year, and I'd go and buy stuff and resell stuff and buy cars and work on them a little bit, fix them up, resell them. That's how I made a living. That's how I supported my family. If you guys go back to one of the life story videos, you'll see where I talk about my dad, when my dad got in a motorcycle wreck in 1979 and got his back broke and was paralyzed from the chest down. And one of the reasons I never left my dad was we were supposed to go that day. He had a V8 Volkswagen. Had a Volkswagen that was on a 55 Chevy frame, had a 350 in it, and we were putting the floor in the car, and we were supposed to go to the metal shop and find the sheet metal to do the floorboard, and I was supposed to go with him, and instead he took my mom to work, and I was pissed. I was a kid. I was a little kid, 1979, so what was I, 10, 11 years old? And when my dad drove out of the driveway, I did what every little kid's done at some point or another. And I said, God, I wish you were dead. And next time I see my dad, he was almost dead. So I lived with that my entire life, and I never left his side because I felt like I was the reason he was paralyzed from the chest down. But the transmission thing, even when I built a transmission, I had a 78 Trans Am with a 455 in it, and transmission went out, didn't have the money to buy one, so went to a salvage yard. I used to tear transmissions apart. Believe it or not, I used to build transmissions on the side. I charged $75 to put a shift kit and rebuild a transmission. And I bought one B&M shift kit and re-drilled separator plates and made my own after that. I'd buy a Transgo shift kit, and back then it was $12. So you had the springs for the valve body, and then you had the B&M separator plate. And these transmissions worked great. But I built them out of used parts. I'd buy a new seal kit that was $9 back then, and I'd do these things for $75 a pop. And I used to build 3, 4 of them a day. So back then I was making pretty good money just hustling transmissions. But the first Turbo 350 I ever built, my dad, I had to work at the shop from the time I got home from school till Dad walked out of the shop. And my dad's paralyzed now. He's paralyzed from the chest down. And he's still on crutches, in a wheelchair, on canes. Actually, on canes. Because when my dad was in the hospital, they tried to get him to buy a wheelchair, and he said, I ain't buying a wheelchair, I'm walking out of here. And they said, your spine's been crushed, or your spine's broke. You've crushed 4 vertebrae, you've got Harrington rods in your back, your left leg's been crushed, you're never going to walk again. And my dad walked it. He told the doctor, are you a fucking betting man? Because if you are a doc, I'm going to get in your ass pocket. And he walked out of that hospital 2 years later. Man's man. Drove that same truck home because my mom couldn't come get him one day. He had a friend bring his truck up to him. My dad had a stick about that long, and he drove that truck home because he wanted to come see his boys. And This is not no bullshit, guys. This is real. This is a true story. But when I'm building that transmission, everything that I did on my cars had to be at night after the shop closed, because we had a shop, had a body shop, and a restoration shop. And during the day it was his time, and then at night it could be my time. So, and I'm going to school every day. My dad was not going to let any of us not go to school, and wanted all of us to be. My dad wanted all of us to be doctors and lawyers. He swore one time when somebody made the comment to him, "That boy of yours just like you. He's going to be building these cars just like you." He said, "I'll break his fucking jaw if he does. He better not." And he used to tell me, "I'll break your jaw if you start working on these damn cars, boy. You need to do something that makes you a real living. Don't work like I have." That didn't do no good. I was hung. I was stuck from back the day that I watched him roll out in that truck and go to the first time I remember him going to a street race. And I'm building that transmission. I'm tired. I get it finished. This is my car. The only thing I got to drive. So I get the transmission built. The next day, did all the work at the shop. Go take it off. He had a transmission vise. I went around the transmission. I walked over to the transmission bench, went to take the transmission off, and I looked, and there lay the thrust washer. I'm like, son of a bitch, I forgot that thrust washer. So I tore the transmission completely back apart. The thrust washer for low and revert was there. So I'm like, son of a bitch. So I put the thing all back together. Now I get to bed about 1 o'clock. I got to get up and go to school the next day. The next day, I come in there, and I go take the transmission, and I'm looking over, because now I'm scared of, and I look, and I'll be damned if there's not 3 clutch springs. I'm like, shit. So I tear this transmission all back apart. This happened 3 times. Until the last time, that day, I didn't go to school. I played sick, what I did. And my dad didn't know that I had actually stayed home, because I talked to Mom about it. And I walked out and around the corner of the shop, and I watched my dad reach over in the parts bin and grab some transmission parts and put them on the bench. Or lay them down on the floor. That was one time it was down on the floor right underneath the transmission. And I was devastated, because my dad was sitting there screwing me over and making me work all this time. And I told him, I come around that corner, and I said, "Dad, why? Why are you doing this to me? You know I need my car, and you keep doing this." He said, "Boy, if you knew what you were doing and you were convinced your work was good, you would have never tore that transmission back apart." That was a hard lesson, but one that served me real well for a long time. I checked and double-checked everything that I did, because I didn't want to find a spare part later. So, now, my dad had big block Chevrolets. Everybody around town all knew about my dad, and he built this he had a black 85 truck that I'd built. It was actually a 78 truck to get past the emissions, put an 85 front end, doors, all this shit, or 81, 82, something like that. But this truck started with a 383 stroker motor that back then, nobody was building stroker motors. This was the latest and greatest new thing. 186 casted heads. You'll use a 400 crank, 400 rods, and he built 383 for this truck. Well, the 383, everything progressed on that truck. It went from a 383, actually it started with a 305 and a turbo. Then it went to a 383, then it went to a big block, then it went to a B&M blown big block, then it went to a motor that he had out of an old school funny car that was a 440-inch 427 aluminum rods, steel crank, aluminum rods, square port heads with a 671 blower. And that's what it ended up having. Now this truck, I put 18 motors in this truck. The story behind this truck is there was 2 trucks. There was 2 black short wide pickups. I was building a 78 Chevy pickup at the time, and my dad comes home one day, and he's got this front clip, doors, interior, everything out like an 83, 84 Silverado. And it's all brand new. Yes, it was brand new in like 87, 88. So he tells me, he goes, "You need to put all that stuff on that truck." Fuck yeah. So I built this entire truck from start to finish. Frame was all fucking done. I mean, I worked my ass off on this deal. When I was porting the cylinder heads, it took me, every day I would come home from school and I would port on them heads for 3 hours. Because after work, which was working in the shop, doing what my dad wanted done, then I got to work on my shit. So I ported on these heads for like 2 or 3 hours every day for months. And it was crazy how much work I put in these heads. And I had this 396 that my dad said, hey, build that 396 right there. So I built that 396. I get this truck all together, and it was prom night. My dad comes out and he paints it black. And this thing is beautiful, beautiful truck. I rolled it outside the paint booth. I'm washing it. I finished putting all the interior in it. It's on prom night now, prom night. And my dad come out and he said, what are you doing? I said, I'm getting my truck cleaned up. I'm going to drive it to prom. He said, your truck? That's my truck. No, it's not. It's my truck. He said, no, that's my front end. That's my doors. That's my motor. That's my transmission. That makes it my truck. And you ain't driving my fucking truck. Well, I was hot. I was pissed. But thinking back to what I said when I was a kid, I had to respect my dad, and I had to do what my dad said, whether I liked it or not. So that truck in my heart was always my truck. So every time it went through changes, it was me doing it. I worked on that truck. Every time he'd blow a motor up or do something to it or want to change something, it was me out there doing it. 18 motors later. I mean, I did one time. My dad went on a trip, and I just put a brand new short block, 454 short block in it, Ford's piston, steel crank, all that, and it had the B&M blower on it. Dad said, hey, now I was going to college at OSU, Okmulgee Tech. And my dad said, hey, put that motor in that truck. He said, you can drive it while I'm gone. My dad never let me drive that truck. Don't think I didn't go out there and slam that motor in that truck and get it running. Now, I didn't know my dad looked at the odometer. So we took the truck, me and a friend of mine that was going over there with me. We was both going to college. And we took that thing to Okmulgee and was street racing it. I didn't know Dad checked the odometer on the truck when he left. So when he comes back, the motor had kind of weak oil pressure, and then the oil pressure was starting to come down on it. So I had the oil pan off of it, pulling the bearings, checking everything to make sure everything was good, and it turned out the pickup had fell off of it. So because one thing I didn't do was back then you brazed the pickup to the oil pump, and it had fell off. And I knew that was probably the problem because I put 2 more quarts of oil in it, and oil pressure came back. So when my dad checks the odometer on the truck, he loses his shit. He said, how in the hell did you put 500 something miles on my truck? I said, well, you said I could drive it. So I drove it back and forth to school, which was in Okmulgee, and I lived at Cromwell at the time. So it was a pretty good hike. Plus, later on, a few years later, he found out about me over there street racing it. And the funny thing was, he didn't get mad about me street racing it. He got mad when he found out I almost got outran by a 69 big tire Camaro. That he was pissed about, and told me, if you would have got outran, if I'd have heard my truck got outrun by that guy with that Camaro, he said, I'd beat you half to death. So from the day my dad went out street racing that 65 short wide pickup, that's all I ever wanted to do. I wanted to race, and that's all I wanted to do. Race, race, race. And my dad always told me, he said, the smart man, the man that puts in the most work, it's not, he said, it's hard to outrun money. He said, so you got to be smarter than the guy with money. You have to be smarter than the size of his wallet. And I live by that because, guys, let me tell you something. When I ran my little 64 Nova, and I'll tell you that story and another deal, the Nova that I built that was in 1991, 89, 90, this car run 970s, and actually was sponsored by NOS for the fastest street car shootout. And that car and my hometown track was why I got out of racing for 18 years, guys. 18 years. I never went back to a racetrack. Never had another race car. Just had street cars. Only would street race. Would not go to a track. And I'll tell you the story of what got me back into going to the racetrack. And you guys are not going to believe why I got back into racing. But that's for another time. 20-minute video. I want to see it. I mean, you guys actually make it up through the whole video. But there's the story of my dad and what got me racing. And how I got caught with the bug. And I've never got over it since. I'm out.